The night came with no stars. The clouds hung thick above the treetops like ash that had forgotten how to fall, and the wind carried the scent of metal and something older. Something like silence trying to hide. Elias Ward sat by the fire in his cabin, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of synth brew, watching the flames dance their slow, orange rhythm across the wood floor. He had grown used to nights like this, alone, untouched by news or visitors. 3 years off-grid on New Terra had taught him how to live without voices and how to stop expecting anything that knocked to come in peace. So when the knock came, soft 3 beats against the old steel door, he didn't move at first, just blinked, then slowly set the mug down. It came again. Not loud, not desperate, but patient. He stood, walked to the door, and rested his hand on the handle, his other hovering near the low-slung pulse tool on his hip. Then he opened it, and the cold spilled in. Not just the night air, but something sharper, something alive. At his feet, wrapped in dark fabric, lay a bundle no larger than a satchel still steaming from the rain. No sound came from it. No motion except for the soft shifting of breath beneath the cloth. Elias crouched slowly, lifted one edge of the wrap and froze. It was a child, or something like one. The skin was smooth and blue, faintly translucent like moonlight through water. The head larger than human proportion, the limbs thin and curled against the cold. But it was the eyes that caught him, huge silver and impossibly still. They stared up at him, not with fear, but something else entirely. Recognition. It blinked once slowly, and something inside Elias cracked. He looked around, saw no footprints, no ship lights, no sign of who had left it, no message, only the rain and the waiting. He whispered low, more to himself than anything. "You're not from here." The child made a soft sound, not a cry, just a breath. He didn't think, didn't calculate risk or analyze origin. He just reached out, scooped the small body into his arms, felt the surprising heat against his chest, and carried it inside. He wrapped it in one of his blankets, laid it near the fire, and sat back, hands shaking only now, realizing what he had done. Outside, the wind began to rise. In the sky above, the clouds shifted, revealing not stars, but something watching, and far beyond the ridgeline, something moved through the trees, too tall, too fluid to be native, too late to warn. But inside the cabin, the child slept, and Elias watched over it. Not because he understood, but because no one else had answered the knock. And someone had to. The wind had changed. Elias felt it first in the way the fire faltered, its flame flickering sideways, for no reason. Then in the shift of the night air, no longer cold, but thick like something was exhaling through the trees. The child still slept beside the hearth, wrapped in a wool blanket too large for its frame, its chest rising and falling with slow, steady rhythm, as if the storm outside meant nothing to it. But Elias knew better. He slid the rifle from beneath the bench by the door, checked the charge, and stepped outside into the dark. Rain had stopped, but the air shimmered with tension. Each step he took into the woods felt heavier than it should, the ground soft but not muddy, the silence deeper than nature allowed. Then he saw it, movement between the trees, not fast, not wild, just wrong, something limping, something tall. He raised the rifle, sighted down the path, and whispered, "You should show yourself now." A shadow staggered forward and collapsed just beyond the reach of the lantern light. Elias moved fast, crouched beside the figure, and froze. It was a woman, at least mostly. Her skin was pale lavender, streaked with veins of silver, her hair braided tight in a pattern that pulsed faintly with light. Her breath shallow but present. Blood dark and iridescent coated her sides, soaking through what looked like ceremonial armor, cracked and scorched. She tried to speak. Her lips moved once, then again, and finally she whispered, "Safe." Then her head slumped back, eyes fluttering closed. Elias didn't hesitate. He lifted her gently, surprised by how light she was, and carried her back through the trees, every branch seeming to lean out of his way, as if the forest itself understood urgency. Inside the cabin, the child stirred, opened its eyes, and made a sound soft and curious. When Elias laid the woman down beside the hearth, the child crawled slowly toward her, placed one small hand on her wrist, and exhaled. A glow passed between them, Not blinding, just quiet, like memory shared. The woman stirred again, eyes blinking open. She looked at Elias, then at the child, then back at Elias. You opened the door. He nodded slowly. She closed her eyes again, but this time it wasn't weakness, it was trust. He sat beside the fire, watching them both. One unknown, one impossible. And all he could think was, I hope I'm not too late for whatever this is. Outside, the storm began to recede, but the woods remained alert. Something had been set in motion, and the forest was holding its breath. The sun never truly rose on New Terra. It leaked gently through the haze, turning the treetops to soft silhouettes and brushing the cabin walls with a tired gold that never quite warmed the bones. Inside, the fire had burned low, and Elias Ward sat beside it, elbows on knees, watching the two strangers who had altered his life overnight. The child stirred first, blinking slowly, the silver in her eyes catching the light. She looked toward the woman, the one who had collapsed in the woods, and reached out her small hand. The woman woke with a sharp inhale, her body stiffening as if ready to fight. But the moment her eyes found the child, all tension dissolved. She leaned up slightly, pain flashing across her face, and whispered a name. Ulika. The child answered with a soft chirp, her fingers curling around the woman's wrist. Elias cleared his throat quietly. I don't mean to interrupt, but I think I deserve a few answers. The woman turned her head slowly toward him. Her eyes were the color of starlight, and when she spoke, her voice had the weight of someone who had traveled farther than most people dreamed. My name is Rhea. This is my daughter. Elias nodded once. Not exactly a normal doorstep delivery. She smiled faintly at that, but it faded quickly. They are hunting her. And I could not keep running? He studied her face. Scratches, bruises, exhaustion, but no fear, only fierce, unwavering will. Who is she really? She is more than she seems. That's not an answer. Rhea hesitated. Then she leaned forward just enough for the firelight to catch the metallic threading beneath her skin, barely visible lines etched like constellations beneath the surface. Ula is the first of her kind. She is the beginning of something they do not understand. That makes her dangerous. Elias frowned. Dangerous how? Not to you, not to anyone who chooses to protect her, but her blood carries memory, power, connection to a lineage that once ruled not by force, but by song. He blinked. I'm sorry, did you say song? Rhea nodded. Our ancestors used to weave light and language. Bloodlines were tied not just by birth, but by resonance. Ula's heart is the first to sing again in generations, and that sound, it scares those who built their empires on silence. Elias glanced at the child, who now sat quietly, drawing lines in the ashes with her fingertip. The patterns shimmered slightly, forming symbols that faded before he could recognize them. So she's royalty? Rhea laughed softly, bitter and proud at once. More than that, she is proof that something new can rise from what was broken. And that's what they fear most. Elias looked down at his hands. I'm no warrior, no scholar. I live in a cabin with a leaky roof and a wood stove older than your technology. She met his gaze. And yet you opened the door. Outside, the wind shifted. The trees whispered. And for the first time in years, Elias felt something stir beneath his skin. Not duty, not fear, but purpose. Something was coming for them, but this time, he would not face it alone. They came just before dusk. No roar of engines, no burst of sound. Just silence folding wrong around the cabin, like the woods had decided to hold their breath again. Elias felt it before he saw them. The way animals don't move, the way the wind refuses to speak. He stepped outside, slow boots firm on the wooden porch, rifle slung across his back. Not raised, not yet. Two figures stood at the edge of the clearing, black-clad from collar to boot, their armor, seamless matte as if light itself bent around them. They did not wave, they did not shout, they simply stared. You're far from your patrol zone, Elias said, voice, flat hands loose at his sides. The taller one stepped forward, mask smooth, unreadable. Mr. Ward, we've been tracking something or someone. He tilted his head slightly. A biological anomaly, small, Quiet blue. Elias didn't blink. You tracking clouds now. The second one chuckled low. Sharp, not amused, but rehearsed. We're looking for a child. One that doesn't belong to you. Elias let the silence answer for a beat, and then said, she's asleep, and she's not a threat. The first agent took a slow step forward. You misunderstand. Her existence is the threat. Elias stepped off the porch, then one foot planted in damp earth, the air between them tightening like a wire pulled taut. You're not taking her. We're not here to ask. Behind him inside the cabin. Rhea crouched in shadow, hand resting over Ula's chest, her breath shallow. Her other hand glowing faintly threads of gold, winding through her skin, like veins turned to light. She whispered something into the child's ear, ancient syllables that barely touched sound, and Ula stirred eyelids, fluttering eyes wide and silver. Outside, Elias moved without ceremony, lifted the rifle, leveled it, not at them, but into the air, fired once. A flare burst against the sky, white smoke spiraling upward, a warning to no one but himself. The agents didn't flinch. They stepped forward together, then stopped, because the ground beneath them trembled. Not from bombs, not from beasts, but from resonance. The cabin pulsed like it had a heartbeat, the trees leaning as if listening, and then Rhea stepped outside. Not fully human. Not fully alien. She glowed light, spiraling around her wrists, rising like mist from her hair. You are not welcome here, she said, voice low, and neither is your silence. The agents drew their weapons too late. A burst of force, silent and sharp, rippled outward from Rhea's chest, tossing both figures back like leaves caught in a wave. They hit the earth hard, weapons sparking useless. Elias didn't smile, didn't speak, just stepped between them and his family and waited. But the agents didn't rise. They vanished not into air, but into light pulled backward as if rewritten. Rhea dropped to her knees, the glow around her fading skin, pale breath, shallow. Elias caught her before she hit the dirt, pulled her close eyes scanning the shadows for more that hadn't come yet. She looked up at him, whispered, "They know," he nodded. "Then we run." They packed what they could in minutes, and when they left the cabin behind, Elias didn't look back. Not because he didn't care, but because what mattered most was ahead of him, sleeping gently on his shoulder, a child that glowed, and a woman who had once ruled stars, now walking through dirt beside him. They found shelter in an old relay station buried in ivy and memory deep in the western ravine, where signals no longer reached and no one came looking, because there was nothing left to take. The power grid still hummed, faintly buried beneath decades of moss and neglect, and Elias knew how to coax it back to life. He worked in silence, his hands remembering how to build when his heart was still learning how to hold. Rhea slept in the far corner. Ula nestled against her chest, breathing in slow pulses of blue light that matched the soft hum of the station walls. When the lights finally flickered back, Elias sat against the far panel and exhaled. It wasn't home, but it was shelter. Hours passed. The rain came again outside, soft as dust against steel, and then Rhea stirred. She sat up slowly, her face lit by the low glow of the power nodes, eyes scanning the room until they found Elias sitting cross-legged, watching her like someone who had run out of questions but couldn't stop caring. "Thank you," she said simply. He didn't answer, just nodded and looked at Ula, who still slept between them, small and peaceful. "She trusts you," Rhea said quietly. I didn't expect that. Elias looked down at his hands. "She didn't have a reason to. Neither did you, but you stayed." Rhea leaned back against the wall, her expression unreadable, her voice distant. "I was trained to protect her, to hide her, to die for her if I had to, but no one prepared me for what would happen if someone else chose to live for her." Elias looked up. "I'm not a soldier. I'm not special. I just heard a knock and decided not to pretend I didn't." Rhea smiled faintly, and that made all the difference. They sat in silence for a while, the kind that isn't empty but full of things unsaid. Then Elias spoke. "She's not just yours anymore." He said it softly, without claim, without pride. Just truth. Rhea looked at him, and for the first time saw not a rescuer, not an outsider, but something harder to name: family. She stood across the room and sat beside him, shoulder to shoulder, warmth shared through worn jackets and shared fear. "Do you regret it?" she asked, opening the door. He glanced at her. Not once, even now. Even now, she leaned her head lightly against his shoulder, eyes closed, and for the first time in days, she rested outside. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of ash and sun. But inside there was fire. Not the kind that destroys, the kind that stays lit even in the dark. The kind that remembers and waits. Because sometimes all it takes to start a new world is one door opened and one hand held without question. It was the kind of silence that wakes you, the kind that isn't the absence of sound, but the presence of something wrong. Elias sat up before he understood why, eyes, sharp heart already pounding, as if his body had sensed what his mind was still trying to name. The lights in the relay station flickered once, then held steady, too steady. He turned and saw Rhea, already awake, crouched beside the cot, one hand shielding Ula, the other, glowing faintly gold threads of energy coiling beneath her skin, like sunlight trying to escape. "They're here," she whispered. Elias reached for the rifle. Didn't need to ask who. He moved to the edge of the doorway. Heart slow, breath steady, every step placed like it mattered, because this time it did. Outside in the mist, shadows moved, not loud, not clumsy. Professionals, 4, maybe 5. Thermal dampeners, no comms, no mercy. One of them stepped through the broken frame of the west window. Elias didn't hesitate. Fired once. The figure crumpled, silent, before it hit the floor. The others moved faster. Flash lines streaked across the walls. White-hot whips of light designed to paralyze, not kill Rhea. Rose in full force, her body, a blur of color and gravity flaring outward, like a nova contained. She didn't scream. She didn't speak. She simply moved. And the room bent around her. 2 of them tried to run. They never made it to the tree line. Elias covered the front, watched the last one approach the main entrance. Slow, careful, gun raised. He whispered, "That's close enough." The man paused just inside the threshold, mask reflecting the low amber lights. "You don't know what she is," he said, voice distorted behind the visor. "She'll burn everything you love." Elias's hands didn't shake. "I'm not afraid of fire." The man raised his weapon but never got the shot off. Rhea moved behind him, too fast, too precise. Dropped him without grace, only silence. When it was over, the station stood quiet again. The bodies vanished in flickers of light as if claimed by whatever had sent them. Elias lowered his rifle, exhaled, then saw Ula standing in the middle of the room, awake, unafraid, watching. She walked toward him, slow and steady, eyes shimmering with soft silver. She reached out, touched his hand, and a burst of warmth filled his chest like the memory of sunlight on a winter morning. Rhea knelt beside them. "We can't stay here." Elias nodded, "But we're not running. Not anymore." Rhea met his gaze. "No. Now we're protecting together." And as they stepped out into the stillness of morning, the first light of dawn broke over the trees, carrying with it something rare. Not peace, but the promise of it. They reached the edge of the ridge by dusk. From here they could see the valley below. Low fields soaked in golden light, the glint of old solar panels catching the sun one last time before it dipped behind the horizon. A shuttle waited near the edge of the field, unmarked, silent, powered by something older than Terran tech, something clearly Lethian. Its hatch was open. The path was clear. Rhea stood with her back to the wind, one hand on Ula's shoulder, the other holding a worn datapad glowing with coordinates to a safe colony half a system away. She glanced at Elias, who sat on a broken crate nearby, elbows on knees, staring down at the clearing like it might bite him. "This is your last chance," she said softly. "You don't have to come." Elias didn't look at her right away. "I know. You've done more than I ever expected. You protected her, protected me. That doesn't mean you owe us anything more." He turned his head slowly. "I don't owe you. I choose you." Rhea blinked, stunned by the simplicity of his answer. He stood, brushing dirt off his jacket, the same one patched a dozen times now, and walked over to where Ula stood in the fading light. She looked up at him, those silver eyes glowing faintly like starlight held in a child's gaze. He crouched down, brushed a lock of hair behind her ear. I wasn't ready for you, he whispered. But I'm not ready to let you go either. Ula smiled and placed her small hand on his cheek, and for a brief moment, a spark passed between them, one not of power, but of belonging. Rhea watched in silence. She saw something sacred in that gesture, more than any ceremony her people had ever written. A bond chosen, not assigned. Love, unasked for, and all the more powerful because of it. When Elias stood, he turned to her. If I come as I am. No titles, no chains. Just a man who answered a knock. Rhea nodded slowly, and we will never ask for more. The wind picked up gently, carrying the scent of old trees and something warmer, like fire remembered, not feared. As the sun vanished behind the ridge, Elias walked toward the shuttle with Ula in his arms and Rhea by his side. He didn't look back, not because he was leaving something behind, but because he had already chosen to stay. The new world was smaller than most maps made it look. It was quiet too, the kind of quiet that lives in warm kitchens and open porches, not the silence of hiding, but of belonging. Years passed the way, stars blink and fade and burn again. Ula grew fast, not just taller, but brighter. Her laughter filled the old rooms of the hillside dwelling they'd built with their own hands, surrounded by trees that hadn't yet learned to be afraid. She called Elias father, not because anyone told her to, but because no other word ever fit. He taught her how to fish and how to build solar fuses from spare parts, how to listen before speaking, and how to stand when no one else would. She asked once if she would ever glow like her mother again. Elias smiled, ran his fingers through her soft silver hair and said, "You already do." They kept no flags above their door, no emblems of empire or rebellion. Just a carving on the wood. 3 lines curved together like orbit, like arms, like the shape of a promise. Rhea came and went on quiet missions, whispered through constellations, but she always returned always to the same warm fire, in the same rough hands that held hers without demand. And one day they came again, not soldiers, not agents, but scholars and storytellers. They stood at the edge of the field holding a small plaque and a request to place it near the garden, in honor of the man who opened a door and changed the meaning of family. The plaque said he had no papers, no bloodline, no crown, but the child called him father. And that was enough. Elias said nothing as they left. Only watched the wind move through the leaves and felt the weight of everything he had not planned, becoming something he would never trade. And when Ula curled up beside him that night, whispered, "Tell me again the story of the knock." He smiled, closed his eyes, and began. Outside, the stars kept watching, but now they were listening too. If someone left you with the impossible, would you run or would you stay and build a life around it? Share your thoughts below and tell us what you would have done if that knock came to your door.